Preface. 9/11 is an unsolved crime of terrorism and mass murder. In its name, wars have been waged, governments overthrown, and an untold number of lives sacrificed. The crime itself, however, which was exploited to usher in the war on terror with its draconian security laws, remains unsolved. 10 years after the terror attacks that changed the world, we still do not know what really happened at Shanksville, what hit the Pentagon, or why 3 skyscrapers collapsed on 9/11. The unanswered questions about the events of September 11, 2001 have not even been addressed by the government officials entrusted with the responsibility to investigate crimes of terrorism and prosecute those behind them. No trial was held in the decade after 9/11 to determine who is responsible for the terror atrocity that killed thousands. It is now very unlikely that there ever will be. The politicians and news media, who should be demanding answers and accountability, are not even interested in discussing the subject. How can that be? To understand why the government and media avoid any serious discussion of 9/11, we need to realize that the terror attacks that changed America were an elaborately planned criminal deception that was not meant to be solved. The false flag terror attacks were designed and carried out with the intention that the public would be deceived with a false explanation, blaming the atrocity on Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in order to get popular support for the pre-planned war on terror and the invasion of Afghanistan. The U.S. military had, in fact, invaded Afghanistan and ousted the Taliban regime before the fires beneath the rubble of the World Trade Center had even been extinguished. That 9/11 was not meant to be solved is evident from the fact that rather than conducting a proper criminal investigation, the federal authorities responsible for prosecuting crimes of terrorism allowed the steel from the Twin Towers, the most crucial evidence from the crime scene, to be destroyed before it could be examined by experts. Other important pieces of evidence, such as the numbered parts from the aircraft, were thrown out like garbage rather than being identified. The outrageous failure by the Department of Justice to protect and properly examine the evidence has resulted in the federal investigation of 9/11 being rightfully labeled a non-investigation. The relatives of the victims and those who had hoped that the truth would be found through litigation in the U.S. judicial system have been greatly disappointed that there has been no trial for any of the families of those killed or the alleged perpetrators of the crime. With all the wrongful death cases having been settled out of court, it is extremely unlikely that there will ever be a trial to determine who is really responsible for the worst act of terrorism to occur on American soil. As a journalist, I began writing about 9/11 shortly after the attacks and quickly realized that the truth was being buried beneath a false story pushed by the U.S. administration and compliant media. It was clear that there was a concerted effort to promote a politically expedient explanation and avoid the evidence and questions that contradicted that account. There was no real effort on the part of the government or the media to actually solve the crime. Although the Bush-Cheney administration did finally appoint a commission and several engineering studies, these were all fundamentally flawed in that they were strictly limited in their scope, denied access to the evidence, and began their investigations by accepting the unproven version as true. By the end of 2006, after nearly 5 years of research and writing about 9/11, it was evident that a form of thermite had been used to demolish the Twin Towers. This was confirmed by the large amount of molten metal found in the rubble and dust, and by the abundance of nanoparticles discovered in the smoke that rose from the burning pile at Ground Zero. Shortly after visiting the 2 scientists whose research confirmed the existence of thermite at the World Trade Center, I was attacked at my home outside Chicago by heavily armed undercover police, arrested, and later charged with assaulting them. Innocent of the false charges, I pled not guilty, and the case went to trial. Although I had discovered evidence showing that the police had conspired to harm me, the judge did not allow it or my expert witness to be presented in court. Video evidence from the police vehicles that would have proven my innocence was destroyed by the police in violation of their own regulations and my formal legal request. The police then openly lied on the stand and presented both false evidence and the fabricated testimony of a witness to the court. With my evidence having been rejected and the police lies accepted by the court, the state won its case against me. Realizing that I was at the mercy of a very corrupt and criminal system that would do anything to silence me, I took my family to Europe in June 2007 before sentencing. Determined to find and expose those who were really behind the terror atrocity, I began writing Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World in September 2007. Having written hundreds of articles about different aspects of the crime, I wanted to present my hypothesis in a coherent and easily readable format. Much of the information in this book is derived from the many investigative articles I have written about 9/11, which are published in a second volume. I recommend reading the companion volume to this book with the collection of my original 9/11 articles to understand how my thesis of Israeli and Zionist involvement in 9/11 developed. Solving 9/11 and my research articles that support it are the work of one man. I wrote this book as a service to the American public and mankind because I could not remain indifferent and watch in silence as the lies about 9/11 were used to wage wars of aggression and transform America into a police state. My hypothesis that 9/11 was an act of false flag terrorism carried out by Israeli military intelligence and Zionist fifth columnists has not been accepted by many in the so-called 9/11 truth movement because it breaks a cultural taboo regarding how Israel and Jews are viewed in America. There are many Zionist apologists who believe that Israel can do no wrong. It needs to be understood that Zionism is a political ideology, not a religion. Although the more belligerent Zionist faction is very well funded and organized and has a highly advanced military at its disposal, it does not represent all Jews. If it is true that Israelis and Zionist partisans are indeed behind 9/11, it does not mean that all Jews are guilty by association. The only people who deserve to be condemned are the criminals behind the terror atrocity and those who have helped to conceal the truth about what really happened. The purpose of this book is to find and expose the real culprits so that the American people and mankind can be liberated from the lies about 9/11. For to submit to such evil deception is to be enslaved by it.
In December 2001, just 3 months after the attacks in New York, Eckhard Werthbach, the former president of Germany's intelligence service, meeting with Christopher Bolin in Germany, said, "The deathly precision and magnitude of planning behind the 9/11 attacks would have needed years of planning. Such a sophisticated operation would require the fixed frame of a state intelligence organization, something not found in a loose group of terrorists like the ones allegedly led by Mohammed Atta while he studied in Hamburg. Many people would have been involved in the planning of such an operation. The absence of leaks is further indication that the attacks were state-organized actions."
Chapter 1. 9/11 Through the Eyes of an American Skeptic. As a journalist with an independent weekly newspaper based in Washington, D.C., I became caught up in the events of 9/11 from the minute it happened and was able to write freely about the terror attacks that were exploited to start the pre-planned war on terror. From my position as a skeptic of the unproven official version, I have examined the facts and evidence since the day it happened and have concluded that the U.S. government and controlled media have engaged in a conspiracy to deceive the world about what really happened on that terrible day. The Dream. The early morning hours of September 11, 2001 found me with my family driving through New York City en route to Washington, D.C., after a weekend trip to Stowe, Vermont. We had visited the Trapp family lodge and gotten a late start from Stowe on Monday afternoon. By the time we reached New York City, our two small children were fast asleep in the back seat of the car. Because the hotels were either full or outrageously expensive, I was left with no choice but to continue driving down the highway when I should have been sleeping. To keep me awake as I drove through New York City, my wife Helia described a vivid dream she had had a week earlier, the night before we had left our home near Chicago. In her dream, we were driving toward a city with a skyline of densely packed skyscrapers when a large airplane flew right at us and plunged into the road about 50 meters in front of our car. She turned and saw the plane emerge from the ground behind us and another plane coming at us from another angle. This was a strange dream in which she felt that our family had been under attack. Helia's dream turned out to be an eerie and uncanny premonition of what was to happen in the skies of New York City less than 8 hours later. It was about 3 a.m. in the morning of September 11th when we finally found an affordable hotel room just inside the state of Maryland on Interstate 95. The kids woke up and jumped on the beds, and then we all fell asleep about a half hour later. I woke up about 8:30 a.m. and went down to the lobby for a cup of coffee. The television was on in the breakfast area, reporting that a plane had struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. I grabbed some pastries and coffee and hurried back to the room and turned the television to the news channel. The children and I went to get more donuts and coffee, and were on our way back to the room when the second plane hit the South Tower. Helia had seen it happen live on television. We were shocked by the events and realized that America was under attack. I immediately called my office in Washington, D.C., and told my boss that kamikaze airplanes had hit the World Trade Center. He thought I was joking. I said I wouldn't joke about such a thing and told him to turn on the radio. I called the office again after the Pentagon was hit and said we would not be coming to Washington, but were heading home to Chicago. Having no idea what would happen next, I thought it would be best to take the country roads and stay away from big cities. We drove through rural Lancaster County, past Amish farmers harvesting a very tall corn crop. I stopped and walked into the fields to ask some of the German-speaking farmers if they knew what had happened in New York City. They said they had not heard anything about it and carried on working with their horse-drawn harvester. Our route from Pennsylvania to Chicago took us near the site in Shanksville where Flight 93 supposedly crashed, but I had no desire to go to the scene of the disaster. We stopped for lunch in a small town. The diner was full of people, but nobody was talking. The people sat quietly, as if mesmerized, listening to the news on the radio. Indications of Israeli involvement. We listened to the radio as we drove across Pennsylvania. It was a beautiful sunny day with a bright blue sky. About noon, I heard a news report that 5 Middle Eastern men had been seen in New Jersey, videotaping and celebrating the destruction of the World Trade Center. Most people automatically associate Middle Eastern with Arab. This early news report immediately planted in the public mind the idea that Muslims were behind the terror attacks. This line of thinking quickly became the accepted explanation, and although it remains unproven, became the official version of 911. The first indication that the attack on the World Trade Center was an elaborate false flag operation came with the arrest of the 5 men on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River. These men, described as Middle Eastern in the first media reports, were later identified as Israelis. A false flag operation is a crime which is designed and carried out so that another party or nation is blamed. The 5 jubilant Middle Eastern men, who had filmed themselves smiling and celebrating with the burning World Trade Center in the background, were identified as Sivan and Paul Kurtzberg, Oded Elner, Omer Marmari, and Yaron Shmuel. 2 of them were actually known to U.S. law enforcement as agents of Israeli intelligence, a fact that was ignored by the media. The Israelis had been observed taking video or photos of themselves with the World Trade Center burning in the background. Sivan Kurtzberg told the police that the men had been driving in their van in the immediate vicinity of the towers that morning. He was photographed flicking a lighter with the burning towers behind him. A woman who had observed the jubilant Israelis said she was struck by the expressions on the men's faces. "They were like happy, you know," she said. "They didn't look shocked to me. I thought it was very strange." When they were arrested, Sivan, the driver of the van, told the police, "We are Israeli. We are not your problem. Your problems are our problems. The Palestinians are the problem." The story of the 5 men celebrating the destruction of the Twin Towers was dropped from the national news when it became known that they were not Arabs or Muslims from the Middle East, but Israelis. The noteworthy fact that these men, who clearly had prior knowledge of the attacks, were in fact Israelis, and that they had been arrested at gunpoint with box cutter knives, multiple passports, and thousands of dollars in cash, driving a van that tested positive for explosives, was only reported by Paulo Lima in a local New Jersey newspaper, the Bergen Record, the following day. This important information, however, was completely ignored by the New York Times and the other national mass media outlets based across the river in New York City. I discussed the details with Paulo Lima on the phone, and this important and suppressed story became the subject of my first article about 9/11. I realized then, during the first week after 9/11, that the mainstream news media was ignoring and covering up important information and evidence about the terrorist attacks. There would be, for example, no reporting in the mainstream media of the evidence of Israeli involvement or prior knowledge of the attacks. This was just the beginning of the censorship the media was to impose on the events of 9/11. The possibility that these men could be Israeli intelligence agents involved in a spectacular false flag terror attack was discussed in my article that went to print in American Free Press on September 20th, 2001. Months later, Forward, a well-known New York-based Jewish newspaper, confirmed that Urban Moving Systems, the Weehawken, New Jersey-based moving company that the men worked for, was actually an Israeli intelligence front operation, and that at least 2 of the men, evidently the Kurtzberg brothers, were known agents of Mossad, Israeli military intelligence. Dominic Suter, the owner of the company and a suspect in the terror attacks, was allowed to flee to Israel after the Federal Bureau of Investigation had initially interviewed him, but before they could interrogate him a second time. He has not been extradited to the United States. After being held for 10 weeks, the 5 Israelis were sent back to Israel on visa violations. Elner, Marmari, and Shmuel appeared on an Israeli television show without the Kurtzberg brothers in November 2001. The 3 Israelis confessed that their mission had been to document the 9/11 attacks. Quote, "The fact of the matter is that we come from a country that experiences terror daily," Oded Elner said. "Our purpose was to document the event." The Israelis' prior knowledge of the attacks reveals their evident complicity in the murder of some 3,000 people. One would think that such a revealing public admission by a suspect, claiming prior knowledge of the terror attack, and saying that his purpose was to document the event, would be extremely newsworthy information in the United States. Sadly, this was not the case. Rather than discuss the evidence, the mainstream media promoted an unproven version of events in which the blame was assigned to 19 Arabs with ties to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. There were other conspicuous indications of Israeli involvement in 9/11 from the beginning. On the day of the bombings, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli politician from the right-wing Likud party, openly stated that he viewed 9/11 as a positive development in an interview with James Bennett of the New York Times. Quote, asked tonight what the attack meant for relations between the United States and Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, the former prime minister, replied, "It's very good." Then he edited himself, "Well, it's not good, but it will generate immediate sympathy." Netanyahu predicted that the attack would strengthen the bond between our two peoples because we've experienced terror of so many decades, but the United States has now experienced a massive hemorrhaging of terror. The New York Times published Netanyahu's comments in an article entitled, "Spilled Blood is Seen as Bond That Draws Two Nations Closer," on September 12, 2001. Journalists who challenge the official version with evidence and facts are marginalized as conspiracy nuts. I have been slandered by the media simply because I have investigated the evidence of Israeli involvement in the terror attacks. The personal attacks against me led to an assault by 3 heavily armed, unidentified men who assaulted me at my home in August 2006. The names of these men, who turned out to be undercover police, were kept secret for a month. Their assault left me with a fractured right elbow and shocked with 50,000 volts from a police device known as a taser. This outrageous and illegal assault occurred at my home in front of my wife and 8-year-old daughter. I was taken to jail and subsequently charged with resisting arrest and aggravated assault, both misdemeanor charges. In the Chicago system of justice, one is forced to plead guilty and accept the sentence meted out by the judge. I refused to plead guilty, however, and spent nearly 1 year trying to defend myself against the baseless charges and malicious prosecution. In early June 2007, I was found guilty of both misdemeanors after a seriously flawed 4-day trial in which the police were allowed to destroy the video evidence and then openly lied on the stand. My expert witness and evidence were not allowed to be presented by the Cook County judge, Hyman Riebman, a Zionist Jew. Having seen that there was no way to obtain justice in the corrupt court system, I was compelled to leave Chicago with my family before the date of sentencing. It would have been irresponsible for me to allow this criminal system to harm me and my family more than it already had. The Odigo warnings. In the first days and weeks after 9/11, I paid very close attention to the large number of Israeli terror suspects arrested, which was more than 200 by November 2001. I also investigated the published reports that an Israeli text messaging service had been used to warn Israelis of the attacks in New York, hours before they occurred. Many Israelis were evidently forewarned of the attacks through an Israeli instant messaging service called Odigo. This story, which presents the clearest evidence of Israeli prior knowledge of the attacks, was reported only very briefly in the U.S. media, and then forgotten. According to the published reports, Israel-based employees of Odigo reported having received warnings of an imminent attack at the World Trade Center hours before the first plane hit the North Tower. Odigo, an Israeli-owned company, had its U.S. headquarters 2 blocks from the World Trade Center, but the forewarned Odigo employees did not pass the terror warning on to the authorities in New York, an act that would have saved thousands of lives. 2 weeks after 9/11, Alex Diamandis, Odigo's vice president, said, "The messages said something big was going to happen in a certain amount of time, and it did, almost to the minute. It was possible that the attack warning was broadcast to other Odigo members, but the company has not received reports of other recipients of the message," Diamandis said. According to a report in the Jerusalem Post, Israel's foreign ministry had collected the names of 4,000 Israelis believed to have been in the areas of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon at the time of the attack, yet only one was reported to have died in the Twin Towers. Based on the number provided by the Israeli government and the number of Israelis thought to have been at the World Trade Center at the time of the attacks, it seems evident that most of them got the warning. Odigo, which offers real-time messaging, has a feature called People Finder, which allows a user to send an instant message to a large group based on a common characteristic, such as Israeli nationality. People Finder allows Odigo users to search for online buddies with filters like Israeli nationality, while maintaining user privacy at all times. The message was probably also sent in Hebrew. The internet address of the sender of the warning was allegedly given to the FBI. 2 months later, it was reported that the FBI was still investigating the matter. Since then, there have been no further media reports about the Odigo warning of 9/11. These two news stories about the fake Israeli movers and the Odigo messages, which clearly indicated that some Israelis had very specific prior knowledge of the attacks, were published in American and Israeli newspapers shortly after 9/11. Had the recipients of these Odigo instant messages contacted the New York Police Department, thousands of lives could have been saved. The question that has not been asked is, why didn't they? Cui bono? There were several early indications that Israelis were involved in 9/11 and that it was a spectacular false flag terror attack designed to serve as a casus belli that could be used to drag the United States into the war on terror. Apart from the previously mentioned evidence of Israeli prior knowledge, there were also the incredibly insensitive comments of Netanyahu about 9/11 being very good in his view. Netanyahu, it should be noted, is the author of several books which call for the Western nations to engage in a global war on terror. Since 1986, Netanyahu has urged the United States and Western democracies to take up arms against the enemies of Israel in the name of fighting terrorism, which is the title of one of his books. The terrorists that Netanyahu wants the West to wage war on, however, all happen to be the people and states opposed to Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian land. I approached the 9/11 investigation with a 25-year history of living in and following the events of the Middle East. After many years of traveling in Europe and the Middle East, I obtained a degree in history from the University of California at Santa Cruz in 1992. My academic emphasis was on Palestine and Israel. After the first U.S. war against Iraq, which I was actively opposed to, I spent my final year of university researching the Soviet occupation of the newly liberated Baltic republics and completing my courses at the University of Bergen in Norway. Fate brought me into the proximity of another mass disaster on the morning of September 28, 1994, when I arrived by ship in Sweden and learned that the Baltic ferry named Estonia had sunk during the night with 852 victims lost at sea. My wife's first husband, a famous Estonian singer named Urmas Alender, was among the missing. While it was abundantly clear that something much more explosive than a monster wave had sunk the ferry, the Swedish government and media pretended that natural forces had caused the catastrophe. In the process of investigating what happened in the ferry disaster, I came to realize that a modern democratic state, like Sweden, could actually be complicit in the cover-up of the mass murder of hundreds of its own citizens. In 2000, when I began working as a journalist for the Washington-based Spotlight, I turned my attention to the mysterious 1996 crash of TWA Flight 800 off the coast of New York. I attended the National Transportation Safety Board's presentation of their findings of what had caused the crash of Flight 800 and was appalled at the obvious cover-up. I noticed how the 3 Jewish members of the board dominated the presentation. The 2-day event ended with the outrageous dismissal of the testimonies of more than 100 eyewitnesses who had testified to having seen a streaking object hitting the aircraft in flight. This eyewitness evidence was categorically dismissed because, according to the youngest member of the board, based solely on the time of day, all of the 100 witnesses must have been drunk and hallucinating. After the presentation of the NTSB findings, there was no press conference or session allowing for any questions from the media or public. This was clearly another cover-up. I had also studied the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty and had seen how the U.S. government and military had covered up the truth of the Israeli military attack on the unarmed Navy vessel off the coast of Egypt in 1967. With this background, I approached the events of 9/11. Well aware of the history of false flag terror, the overwhelming Zionist influence in government and media, and corrupt official investigations of recent mass disasters, I was skeptical from the start. Evidence of explosions ignored. The administration of George W. Bush rushed the nation and its allies into war in Afghanistan within 1 month of the 9/11 attacks, using the unsolved crime as the casus belli to justify a war of aggression that had been planned long before. The war against the government of Afghanistan, called Operation Enduring Freedom by the government and military, began on October 7, 2001. The week before the war began, I wrote an article about the immense oil and gas reserves of the Caspian Basin and the new Great Game to gain control of these valuable energy resources. I also wrote several articles about the long-standing business and personal ties between George W. Bush and the bin Laden family. 1 month after 9/11, I wrote about how the mass media was ignoring the large number of eyewitness accounts describing explosions at the World Trade Center before the collapse of the Twin Towers and Building 7. Quote, despite reports from numerous eyewitnesses and experts, including news reporters on the scene who heard or saw explosions immediately before the collapse of the World Trade Center, there has been a virtual silence in the mainstream media, I wrote in the article entitled, Some Survivors Say Bombs Exploded Inside the World Trade Center. After the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Van Romero, an explosives expert and former director of the Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center at New Mexico Tech, told the Albuquerque Journal minutes after the collapses. The collapse of the structures resembled controlled implosions used to demolish old structures and was, quote, too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structures, Romero said. Coming from a man who is an expert in the effects of explosives on structures, Romero's comments carried a lot of weight, in my opinion. Quote, it would be difficult for something from a plane to trigger an event like that, Romero said. If explosions did cause the towers to collapse, it could have been a relatively small amount of explosives placed in strategic points. One of the things terrorist events are noted for is a diversionary attack and secondary device, he said. Then, suddenly 10 days after the attack, without any explanation, Romero did a complete about-face in his analysis of the collapse. Quote, certainly the fire is what caused the buildings to fail, he told the Albuquerque Journal on September 21, 2001. A friend of mine from Brooklyn told me that he had been standing among a crowd of people on Church Street, about 2 blocks from the South Tower, when he saw, quote, a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes, accompanied by a crackling sound, immediately before the tower collapsed. Even a veteran 51-year-old firefighter, Louis Caccioli, told People magazine that he had witnessed explosions in the South Tower. Quote, I was taking firefighters up in the elevator to the 24th floor to get in position to evacuate workers. On the last trip up, a bomb went off. We think there were bombs set in the building. What is most peculiar about the eyewitness reports of explosions was that they were completely ignored by the mainstream news media, even when the reports came from their own reporters on the scene. Stephen Evans of the BBC, for example, was in the South Tower where he witnessed a series of explosions and felt a big explosion from much, much lower. Yet the BBC, like the rest of the mainstream media, failed to investigate or even discuss the evidence of explosions in the towers. How did the editors of the mass media networks in the United States and Britain make the decision not to discuss the evidence of explosions, even when the information came from their own reporters on the scene? Eyewitness reports and images of explosions were broadcast only once and then swept under the carpet. It soon became quite clear that the mass media was censoring any discussion of the evidence of explosions in the World Trade Center. Within a few weeks, I realized that the media and government were working together to deceive the public about what had really happened on 9/11, and that there was a massive conspiracy afoot to promote a false version of events in order to gain public support for a previously planned war policy in the Middle East. The mass media was clearly engaged in a comprehensive propaganda campaign to instill fear in the public. I decided that Europe would probably be a safer and saner place to be, so at the end of November, after the Thanksgiving holiday, we flew to Germany. The destruction of evidence. In Germany, I had the opportunity to interview Andreas von Bülow in Bonn. Von Bülow is the author of 2 books about 9/11 and a former member of the Bundestag, the German parliament. While in the government, he served on the parliamentary commission which oversees the 3 branches of the German Secret Service. Von Bülow told me that he thought Israel's intelligence service, the Mossad, was behind the 9/11 attacks. These attacks, he said, were carried out to turn public opinion against the Arabs and boost military and security spending. You don't get the higher echelons, von Bülow said, referring to the architectural structure which masterminds such terror attacks. At this level, he said, the organization doing the planning, such as Mossad, is primarily interested in affecting public opinion. The terrorists who actually commit the crimes are what von Bülow calls the working level, such as the 19 Arabs who allegedly hijacked the planes on September 11th. The working level is part of the deception, he said. 95% of the work of the intelligence agencies around the world is deception and disinformation, he said, which is widely propagated in the mainstream media, creating an accepted version of events. Journalists don't even raise the simplest questions, he said. Those who differ are labeled as crazy. Eckhard Werthebach, the former president of the Verfassungsschutz, a branch of German intelligence, told me that the deathly precision and the magnitude of planning behind the attacks would have needed years of planning. Such a sophisticated operation, Werthebach said, required the fixed frame of a state intelligence organization, something not found in a loose group of terrorists. Both Werthebach and von Bülow said the lack of a complete blue ribbon investigation with congressional hearings into the events of September 11th was incomprehensible. These men made more sense to me than anyone in the U.S. government or media. As incomprehensible as it might seem, the Bush administration delayed and avoided an official investigation for as long as possible, at least until all the evidence was destroyed. The steel from the World Trade Center was quickly shipped to Asia, where it was melted down. The evidence from the crime scene was being destroyed as quickly as possible. This was clearly criminal, yet the highest authorities in the U.S. government and the Department of Justice were allowing it to happen. Molten metal. 9/11 is an unsolved crime, and I have done what I can to solve it using the available evidence. In the summer of 2002, for example, I wrote an article about the seismic data that showed unexplained spikes occurring at the beginning of each collapse. In my research into the removal of the rubble, I learned from one of the contractors and a demolition expert that molten metal had been discovered at the bottom of the rubble pile in the lower basement levels. This molten metal was described to me as molten steel by Peter Tully, president of Tully Construction of Flushing, New York, and Marc Loiseau, president of Controlled Demolition Incorporated of Phoenix, Maryland. The molten steel was found 3, 4, and 5 weeks later when the rubble was being removed, Loiseau said. He said molten steel was also found at WTC 7, the 47-story building owned by Larry Silverstein, which collapsed mysteriously in the late afternoon. Loiseau said, "If I were to bring the towers down, I would put explosives in the basement to get the weight of the building to help collapse the structure." The molten metal found beneath the rubble was clearly important evidence that could explain how the towers were brought down. Because each tower was held up by 47 huge core columns, there had to be an explanation for what caused these columns to fall. The official explanation that fires had caused the floor trusses to give way failed to explain what happened to the core columns. To explain the extremely quick collapse of the core columns, the seismic spikes and molten metal seemed to be very important clues. Stephen E. Jones, a professor of physics at Brigham Young University, BYU, in Utah, contacted me in the summer of 2005 and asked me what I had learned about the discovery of molten metal at the World Trade Center. I told Jones exactly what Peter Tully and Marc Loiseau had said about the discovery of molten iron in the basements of the Twin Towers and Building 7. After studying the reports and photographs of molten metal, Jones had been able to obtain some fragments of the metal. He concluded that the fragments were primarily iron and possible evidence that thermite had been used to demolish the buildings. Encouraged by his research, I visited Professor Jones on the campus of Brigham Young University in the spring of 2006. From Provo, Utah, I then traveled by train to the University of California at Davis, where I met with Professor Thomas A. Cahill, an expert on airborne particles. Dr. Cahill had conducted a study of the particles contained in the thin bluish smoke that rose from the rubble for nearly 4 months after 9/11. Cahill's air sampling began on October 2nd and continued until late December 2001, when the last fires were finally extinguished. Asked why it took so long to begin a scientific evaluation of the air contamination that accompanied the destruction of the World Trade Center, Dr. Cahill said he had assumed that there were scores of agencies and scientists monitoring the air quality in New York City after 9/11. "I assumed it was happening. I could not believe it was not," Cahill said. The Environmental Protection Agency did nothing. Cahill's work revealed the presence of extremely small metallic aerosols in unprecedented amounts in the plumes coming from the burning World Trade Center rubble. Most of the particles in these plumes were in the categories of ultrafine and nanoparticles, from 0.26 to 0.09 microns. The extraordinarily high level of ultrafine aerosols was one of the most unusual aspects of the data, Cahill said. Ultrafine particles require extremely high temperatures, he said, namely the boiling point of the metal. Since the scientific data supports the theory that some form of thermite was used to destroy the towers, the question is how it got onto the 81st floor of the South Tower, where large amounts of molten metal were seen falling before the collapse. The official final report of the fires does not explain what was on the 81st floor, which seems odd because this is the floor leased by Fuji Bank into which the airplane crashed. A former employee of the bank came forward and told me that the bank had reinforced the floor in 1999 to support a very heavy load of computer backup batteries. The whole floor was batteries, he said, huge battery-looking things. They were all black and solid, very heavy things, which had been brought in during the night. They had been put in place during the summer prior to 9/11, he said. But were they really batteries? It's weird, he said. They were never turned on. So, what really was on the 81st floor of the South Tower? What was in these heavy battery-looking things? Were they batteries or were they thermite? And is it more than a coincidence that both planes flew directly into secure computer rooms in both towers, and that both spectacular explosions showed evidence of thermite-produced white smoke? The cover-up continues. Despite the legal difficulties, slander, criticism, and other setbacks, I have continued to examine the evidence from 9/11 and ask the questions that demand to be answered. The lost lives of the thousands of victims of the terror attacks and the illegal wars that have been waged in the name of 9/11 deserve to be honored with the truth, not a pack of lies pushed by the controlled media onto a gullible public. It would be naive and foolish for us to expect the truth from a government that has been shown to have repeatedly lied to the media and international community in order to accomplish its dubious goals. The truth of 9/11 will certainly not be given to us on a silver platter. It is something we will have to fight for. Hello, I am Christopher Bolin, author of the book Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. This video is called The Revolution Begins with 9/11 Truth and is based on an article published on my website, bolin.com. I will be talking about why 9/11 Truth is essential for our freedom and the future of the American Republic. One does not need to scrutinize every detail of the 9/11 saga to realize that the government and mass media are complicit in deceiving the public about the terror atrocity of September 11, 2001. The government and media have lied about what happened on 9/11, and their treasonous deceit was used to take our nation into two very costly wars, which in reality were wars of aggression. As we slide into the next presidential campaign, with the leading candidates chosen from America's most notorious criminal families, 9/11 Truth is the one issue that is not open for discussion. Our politicians avoid 9/11 Truth because the criminal cabal that is behind the 9/11 atrocity and cover-up also controls our mass media and sham elections. So what's a person to do? What can we do is the question I am asked most often when I present the research from my Solving 9/11 books. That this question is asked so often indicates that this is on the minds of many people in the truth movement. 9/11 Truth is, after all, a revolutionary movement, which is why so many people balk at the idea of getting involved. While the average person may not understand all the details of the false flag deception that changed our world, they do understand that 9/11 Truth presents them with an uncomfortable dilemma. Either they stick with the government's false narrative dished out by the mass media, or they join the truth movement, which challenges the government about what happened on 9/11. Although the government's story about 9/11 was used to take the nation into two wars in which millions of innocent people were killed and wounded, many Americans are still reluctant to take a position that challenges the government narrative and which may put their social status and financial well-being at risk. So when people ask what they should do, I suggest that they help spread 9/11 truth, because awareness has to precede action. By reading my Solving 9/11 books, most people can comprehend the deception that changed the world and understand who is behind it. The 9/11 Truth Movement is calling for the government to conduct a new investigation. This is certainly a reasonable demand, but we need to consider two things. First, we need to understand that there was no proper criminal investigation of 9/11 to start with. And secondly, that the investigation was prevented by the same anti-American cabal that controls our government, the White House, and the mainstream media. Another aspect of the 9/11 conundrum is how do we obtain justice and prosecute the 9/11 crimes when the culprits control the financial and political regime that rules America? Clearly, there is no will within the political establishment to deal with the issues raised by the 9/11 Truth Movement. It seems logical to conclude that this is because Washington is controlled by the very same people who carried out 9/11, who managed the cover-up, and who foisted the deception on the nation. 9/11 Truth is the pivot upon which American history will turn. Which way it turns is up to us. The nation obviously needs to go through a political catharsis in which the crimes of 9/11 are investigated and the perpetrators and their supporters are purged and punished. The sooner this purge happens, the better. It is now nearly 14 years overdue, and the longer this necessary action is delayed, the worse our political predicament will get. Such a purge is essential to curing the American Republic of the cancer that is killing it. If this purge does not happen soon, the American Republic will cease to exist as a democratic form of government. As the Declaration of Independence says in its opening paragraphs, it is our right and duty to throw off such government that commits a long train of abuses and usurpations and evinces a design to put the people under absolute despotism. I don't know when the purge will happen or how it will come about, but I can say that it is inevitable. It is delusional to think that a new president selected by the criminal cabal that rules Washington will bring about meaningful change. The cabal will not purge itself, and the culprits of 9/11 will never investigate their own crimes. It is, therefore, essential to understand that 9/11 Truth is revolutionary. It is the pivot and the Achilles heel through which the criminal cabal that has hijacked our government will finally be exposed and purged. Corrective actions which are long overdue, but absolutely required for the restoration of the American Republic. So, what can we do to help make this happen? The most important thing is to inform ourselves and others about the deception that changed our world. If you would like to know more about the 9/11 deception, visit my website and read my books, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, and Solving 9/11, the original articles. The Solving 9/11 books are available through my website, Bolin.com, good bookstores, or Amazon.com. Thank you.